There is a kind of soldier history tends to forget. Not because he did not fight. Not because his record was thin or his sacrifice small. But because the machinery of memory, the official reports, the commendations, the columns of newsprint was not built for him. It was built around him, past him, sometimes deliberately away from him. Charles A. Gates was one of those soldiers. He was born in Kansas City, Missouri, in a country that had already decided, before he ever held a rifle, what kind of man he was allowed to be. A country that built its army on a principle of separation, white units and black units, white officers and black officers, held to different standards, different facilities, different futures. He entered that army anyway, not out of innocence, out of something harder than innocence. It was April 1941. The war in Europe had been burning for nearly 2 years. The Pacific was quieter, but only just. Charles Gates was 29 years old, lean and quick, a man who had spent his younger years competing, swimming, tennis, a man built for precision and endurance. He reported to Fort Riley, Kansas, and found himself inside one of the oldest traditions the American military possessed, the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers. The 9th and 10th Cavalries had been stationed at Fort Riley for decades. These were black regiments with records stretching back to the Indian Wars, men who had bled for a country that refused to fully acknowledge them. And it was here, under the instruction of old sergeants who had never been given much formal schooling, but who knew the field manual, the way a craftsman knows his tools, that Gates received the foundation of his military education. He watched how the institution worked. He watched how every new white officer who arrived was quietly directed toward those same old black sergeants, the ones who actually knew what combat preparation meant, the ones whose knowledge was borrowed without credit. He had planned to serve his 12 months and leave. The army had other ideas. His regimental commander approached him, asked him whether he'd be interested in officer candidate school. Gates declined. The commander cited the field manual, FM 105-1. He asked Gates what a soldier was required to do when a commanding officer made a request. Gates answered precisely, "A request, in that context, is considered an order." The commander said, "Then sign the papers." Gates signed. That was how he became an officer, not by choice. By the Army's own logic turned back on itself. He went to OCS at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the summer of 1942. The classroom was not natural territory for him. He had always been a man of movement, of outdoors, of physical problem solving. He slept through the first days of instruction. The instructor threatened demerits. Gates said he hadn't wanted to come in the first place. 6 weeks later, when the first examinations arrived, half the class washed out. Gates scored a 96. After that, the instructor let him sleep. Fort Knox gave him a commission. Louisiana showed him what that commission was worth. At Camp Claiborne, in the winter of 1942, he was a lieutenant in command of a platoon. The nearest town was Alexandria. The camp had placed black troops in the sewage area, a deliberate arrangement, a statement made without words. When officers went into town, white MPs patrolled the streets. They told black officers they were not required to carry sidearms. The others did. Gates went into town, armed anyway. When they questioned him, he answered simply, he was performing the same duty. He intended to be equally prepared. They threatened him with charges. He told them his parents would be just as proud of him, dishonorably discharged as they would be of a general. And that since he was in this thing, he intended to follow rules and regulations, and that he had studied them carefully. They backed down. He was, by his own admission, perhaps foolish. But there is another word for it too. Early in 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion was ordered to Fort Hood, Texas, for advanced training. They ran exercises against tank destroyer units, both white and black, and they beat them consistently. Word got around. Their reputation inside the training system was, by any objective measure, excellent. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, put in a request for the best separate tank battalion remaining in the United States. He wanted them for the drive across France. The army sent him the 761st. Patton had said, publicly, that black men were incapable of operating tanks. The equipment was too technical, the demands too complex. Then he walked out to observe his new battalion, and found himself looking at the unit the army itself had certified as its best. The general stood in front of them and spoke plainly. He told them they were the first black tankers ever committed to combat in the American Army. He said he wanted them to establish a record for themselves and for their race. He told them to make a liar out of him. The men around Gates apparently whooped at this, at the peculiar spectacle of a white general instructing black soldiers to shoot white enemies. There was a dark humor in it that only they could fully appreciate. Gates laughed too, and then they shipped out. They landed in France in the fall of 1944. What followed was 183 days of continuous combat. 183 days. No relief. Almost no replacements. France, Belgium, Holland, the Siegfried Line, into Germany, finally to Steyr in Austria. Always attached to larger white divisions, always the unit sent into the worst positions, always the ones tasked with breaking what couldn't be bypassed. The mathematics of a separate tank battalion's survival were grim. Military planners had calculated the average operational lifespan of such a unit at 10 to 12 days. After that, the losses were typically so severe that the unit would be crossed off the rolls, its survivors folded into other formations. The 761st went 183 days. That number sits outside the expected range of what was supposed to be possible. They were split constantly. 3 platoons divided further into pairs, then scattered across different divisional fronts. The Germans plotting American positions on their maps reportedly could not understand it. They interrogated prisoners. They asked how many divisions of black tankers there were. There were none. There was only this one battalion, spread thin enough to appear everywhere at once. In one engagement, during the push through forested terrain, the battalion was having trouble dislodging German infantry from the tree line. The tanks had been firing too low. Gates ordered his crews to elevate their fire, aim for the canopy, let the shells explode above and among the branches, driving shrapnel downward through the trees and dropping timber on the men below. The Germans came out with their hands up, calling out the word for surrender, calling out the word for comrades. Gates ordered his crews to keep their hatches buttoned and direct the prisoners back toward the infantry. One crewman opened his hatch too early. The Germans looked in. They saw a black face. The word passed through them instantly. Black soldiers, and they broke and ran back toward the woods. Gates gave the order to cut them off. Eventually they came back out. They had apparently decided that surrendering to black soldiers was preferable to the alternative. He became a captain. When C Company lost its commander to wounds, and its roster to casualties, 8 dead, 36 hospitalized, Gates took command and held it through the end of the war. They started with 750 men. By the end, 35 had been killed in action. 293 Purple Hearts, 6 Bronze Stars, 11 Silver Stars. These were the awards processed through the white divisions to which the 761st had been attached, divisions that by institutional reflex prioritized their own. Gates calculated it plainly. Every Bronze Star in his battalion should have been a Silver Star. Every Silver Star should have been a Medal of Honor. They had received the crumbs. The crumbs were still remarkable, but the awards were the smallest part of what was withheld. The 761st Tank Battalion had been attached to at least 12 units that received Presidential Unit citations. The battalion itself had not. The campaign for that citation began in 1945, when the war was still ending. It moved through Congress repeatedly, introduced, tabled, introduced again. 1966, 1967. The years accumulated. The men aged. Some died before the bureaucracy finished with them. In January 1978, President Carter signed the order. 33 years after the men of the 761st had fought their way across 6 countries, the citation was granted. Gates was there at the reunion. He noted, as he noted every year, that the roll call was shorter than the year before. There was one battle, at a place called Hunskirch, that Gates did not easily recount with laughter. A colonel, not a combat officer, a finance officer, with no frontline experience, given command of an infantry regiment, had ordered the 761st to advance tanks straight down a road in the face of identified German defensive positions. Gates recognized the approach as tactically indefensible. He made his objections. He delayed the attack for 4 hours. Then came the direct order. Within 5 minutes, 5 tanks were destroyed. Gates was shot out of his own tank. 2 of his men were hospitalized. He collected himself and made a decision from that day forward, regardless of rank. He would tell his men whether an operation was survivable before they executed it. He would not sacrifice them to incompetence again. He knew what this decision would cost him institutionally. He accepted it. He was not a man given to grievance as a way of life, but he was precise about what had happened and what it meant. The army, in the months after the war ended, sent intelligence officers into the areas where black troops had been stationed to conduct surveys, to compile negative assessments of black soldiers, to suggest unreliability, to counteract what the combat record had proven. Gates knew this had happened. He said it plainly. It was not rumor or suspicion. It was policy. He left the service. He went to Tuskegee to study veterinary medicine. His mother fell ill. He stayed home. He went into the postal service, the durable work of the neighborhood, but he couldn't entirely leave behind what he knew how to do. In 1949, the Missouri National Guard was organizing a new unit. A congressman had declared that black men were incapable of running a military headquarters. Gates heard this. He accepted command. 1 year, he told himself. He served until 1964. The unit became one of the most commended National Guard commands in the 5th Army area. At Camp Clark, 3 streets were named for outstanding guardsmen. One of them was named Gates. He still attended the annual reunions of the 761st. Every year, he noted, there were fewer chairs filled. The men who remained were old, moving carefully, some carrying the weight of things they had never entirely set down. They were men who had been told, before they ever left home, that the equipment was too complex for them, that the demands were beyond their capacity, that history did not have a place for them. They had gone anyway. They had learned to fire high into the trees. They had gone 183 days. They had broken the Siegfried Line and driven into Austria and come home and waited 3 decades for a piece of paper acknowledging what the men who served beside them had known all along. Their motto was 4 words: come out fighting. Gates said it at the end, with the simplicity of a man who had been living inside it for 40 years. After the close of hostilities, they just kept on fighting. It was, he said, just that simple. The street at Camp Clark still bears his name. Most people driving past it do not know why.